Welcome to Brothers in Cars. My name's Rob Akins. I'm here with my brother Fred Akins. And today we're going to talk about Stellantis and what has happened to the renowned Jeep name, especially, although also Ram trucks and Chrysler and Dodge. And so, Fred is a longtime veteran of the auto industry, and we like to talk about what's happening and maybe why it's happening. And so, Fred, Stellantis finds itself in a world of hurt right now, which is kind of funny because a couple of years ago, they were the darlings of the domestic automakers. They were making huge profits. They were selling everything that they could get to the dealer lots, but now not so much. So what's going on?
Well, you have to think of it that Stellantis is a bit of a cautionary tale. This is what happens when your executives start believing the company press releases about how wonderful they are and how wonderful the company's products are. And um, so let's go back a little bit and remember how Stellantis was created, because this was not a natural merger or something like that. Stellantis was created by the merger of Fiat Chrysler, FCA, which is Ram, Jeep, Dodge, Chrysler, Alfa Romeo, Fiat, Maserati, and maybe a couple of other sub brands. And then on the French side, you had PSA Group, which is Peugeot, Citroën, and they acquired during the run up to Stellantis, they acquired GM's former European operations, which was Adam Opel in Germany and Vauxhall in England. Now, how anybody thought that combining a bunch of perennially troubled, struggling automakers into some sort of massive conglomerate was going to create this international juggernaut. I'm sure that the investment bankers all used wonderful buzzwords like synergies and, reducing overhead and duplication of
Leverage.
efforts, leveraging positions and everything. And guess what? There's what happens when you combine a couple of struggling automakers or perennially struggling automakers into one big automaker is you get one big perennially struggling automaker. You do not get economies of scale because you've already got the scale.
Right.
So what happened was, for a while, coming out of the pandemic, because they were created in January of 2021, coming out of the pandemic, everybody was selling cars hand over fist. Because the governments around the world were just pumping out money, and capital was dirt cheap. You remember, 0% interest. Everybody was handing out money, and customers who were stuck at home realized, hey, I may be stuck at home, but what are some things I can do? I can either spend money on my house or where I live, or I can buy a new car or truck.
Right.
And
And interest rates were zero, basically. So car companies, instead of having to throw a bunch of money on the hood, they could offer subsidized loan rates up to 72 months, even 84 months in some cases. And maybe people were starting to go back to work, but they maybe were working from home 3, 4, 5 days a week. They weren't commuting. They weren't paying for lunches. They weren't having to pay for work clothes, etc. So they had some extra money rattling around their pockets, and they thought, hey, now's a good time to upgrade the vehicle. I've got some extra spending money. I've got low interest rates. Let's go out and shop.
Yes. And once they did, the only you still couldn't really go into restaurants and do all that other stuff, but you could go for a drive and you could get out and about. And so that's what people did. They bought a new car and they went places just to get out of the house where they had been stuck for most of 2020 and part of 2021. So that's sort of the background. Now, what happened? Well, if you remember a little over a year ago, the UAW saw the profits that the domestic big three were making, and they were making some pretty good profit numbers. And the UAW quite militantly raised their hand and said, "We want ours." And they engaged in a fairly lengthy, several months long strike. But instead of their usual pattern of, okay, we'll pick one company and we'll make their lives miserable, and then the other companies will fall in line and we'll get the same contract. The UAW, again, it was a master stroke. They basically struck everybody at once.
Right. And they would be strategic about which plants they'd strike, if they were striking parts facilities, manufacturing facilities, et cetera. They're trying to ramp up where they were hitting them to put more and more pressure
Right.
on the big three.
They were very smart. They figured out where the big three's pain points were. And for Stellantis, their pain points were, quite frankly, the Jeep plant in Toledo, where they make most of their Jeeps, and the Ram truck facility in Michigan. And those are the plants that they struck. And guess what? As soon as they started going after each company's cash cows, which was trucks and SUVs, all of a sudden, the big three really got serious about their offers, and eventually the strike was settled. I guess that was about a year ago.
Yep.
And one of the things that, in Stellantis's case, one of the things the UAW got back was a pledge from Stellantis management that they would reopen the former plant in Belvidere, Illinois, which you drive by on I-90 on the Illinois Tollway. And that had closed temporarily because the products that were built there, a couple of forgettable Jeeps and Dodge crossovers, they weren't selling very well. But what Stellantis management promised them was a new mid-sized truck that was going to go into that plant. And I remember the stories coming out, and that was basically the UAW confirmed Stellantis's forward product plan and said, yes, there's a mid-sized Ram truck coming. But there was no real timeline. But all of the speculation was it was going to be 2024, 2025 in there. Well, now you fast forward to this year, and economic conditions have gotten a little bit difficult. And Stellantis, because in the midst of all this, because they had the new contract they had to pay for, and because they were getting really good reviews on their products, like I said, they started to buy into their own press releases and drink their own Kool-Aid. And they thought, well, we can just keep raising our prices, because look at what Ford and GM are doing with their truck prices. Their truck prices are going through the roof. We're going to keep pace. And especially with Jeep and Ram, they not only kept pace, they probably overreached a little bit.
Yeah, and that's something that I've read some pieces and watched some stories online about. The dealers were kind of warning Stellantis management, hey, we've had some really good times the last 12, 18 months, but don't keep raising prices. Our customers cannot keep paying these prices, and you're going to price yourself out of competitiveness. And it seems like that's kind of what's happened, because the month supply that are sitting on the lot of Jeep and Ram trucks especially is getting a little scary.
Oh yeah. No, they definitely got out ahead of their, if you'll pardon the expression, their supply lines as far as the prices they were charging. I mean, if you look in the paper now, you can get five-figure discounts on some Jeep and Ram models. And at the same time, uh, you've got a couple of other brands that are basically afterthoughts within the halls of Stellantis. You've got Dodge, which for a number of years has been Hemi Central.
Mm-hmm.
If you wanted a V8 powered muscle car, you went to a Dodge dealer. That's the only place you went. And Chrysler, they basically had two products. They had the 300 sedan, which in its last iteration was a really, really good vehicle. But it was a big V8 powered sedan. And the American market has basically, or the American consumer has basically voted with their feet and said, no, I don't care how good your sedan is. I want a crossover. I want a station wagon in hiking boots.
Right.
So that vehicle was going away. Same thing with the Dodge Charger, unless you're a police force.
Right.
Um, and they're still peddling the Hemi powered uh, Dodge Durango, now with 700 and something horsepower from a supercharged Hemi motor. It's a lot of fun, but it's not really relevant. Um,
No, and the scary thing is we're into the 2025 model year now, and there are a lot of 2024 Jeep, Ram, Dodge, and Chrysler products sitting on lots that are not moving.
no, they're basically anchored to the lot. Um, and as the saying in the industry goes, there's a butt for every seat. It's just a question of how much money you're going to have to put on the hood or in the trunk to move the metal.
And that seems to be what the dealers are telling Stellantis is you need to step up and throw us some money, throw the customer some money, throw the dealers some money, give us some favorable financing, because we've got to move these things because it's costing us a lot of money to hold them on the lot in inventory while we're supposed to be accepting new 2025s.
Exactly. And clearing out old stock, uh, well, number one, when you put money on the car, either to the consumer or to the dealer, you wind up essentially destroying your resale values. Now that's a, now that's something that most companies, you know, when they've got to hit their sales number, they don't worry about destroying their resale values. That's something that's something for the finance department to worry about 2, 3, 4 years down the road.
Right.
Um, so anyhow, on top of all this, as a nice little overlay, you have the efforts of the current administration through the Inflation Reduction Act um, to promote a transition to EVs. And Stellantis, previously FCA, they were a laggard in the transition to EVs. They were never really all in, um, which turns out to have been very fortuitous for them, because unlike GM and Ford, they weren't hemorrhaging billions of dollars on their EV programs. They were putting billions toward them, but the payoff hadn't gotten there. So Dodge has just shown their new Charger EV, and it's going to come as a I think it's a 600 or 700 horsepower EV, and it looks like a Dodge Charger, a classic Dodge Charger, if you squint. Now the question is, will the guys driving around in Dodge Chargers and Challengers with the Hemi under the hood, will they suddenly get religion and say, oh yes, sign me up for an EV?
Right, because one of the big attractions of the Hemi engine is the accelerator is known as the loud pedal.
Exactly.
And when you press down on the accelerator of an EV, it's not loud.
Well, Stellantis has an answer for that.
Mm-hmm.
Fake engine noise. Based on people I've talked to who have heard it, they say it's not bad, but again, it's artificial.
Now, is that piped into the car, inside the car for the driver to hear,
Yes.
or is that external?
No, it's piped into the car for the benefit of the driver and passengers, because to pipe it outside of the car would be antisocial and violate noise ordinances. Because that's one of the reasons that municipalities have noise regulations, and they're only going to get tighter.
So it's the equivalent of your car saying, "Oh, you're so strong. You're so big and strong."
Yeah, just your car's whispering to you, "Oh, you are so macho.
Yes.
Please
Muy macho.
give me more." So anyhow,
So
you've got that.
So let's talk about where does Stellantis go from here? I mean, Stellantis at risk of going bankrupt? Are they? Do they have to shed some of their brands? Are they looking to sell some of their brands? I know that there's been talk that they're selling their proving ground in Arizona to try to lower costs and raise some money. So what's the future of the brand at this point?
Well, that's the $1 billion question, because Stellantis. First of all, you need to realize that Stellantis has 14 separate brands under the Stellantis umbrella. Now, we've only talked about the American side, or the domestic side. We haven't really talked about all of what I call the weak sisters in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
The strongest brand they probably have is Peugeot, which, of course, here in America is non-existent and has been since the mid-'80s. Although there was talk about bringing it back. They also have, and I'll try and go through these more or less alphabetically. They have Abarth, which I never thought of as a brand. I thought of it as a trim level,
Right,
for sporty Fiats. Evidently, they consider it a separate brand. They have Alfa Romeo, a perpetually struggling Italian manufacturer, which used to be sports cars and sports sedans, but is now basically a sports sedan, no sports cars anymore, and a couple of crossovers.
which is kind of a shame because, as the boys on old Top Gear used to say, you can't call yourself a petrol head until you've owned an Alfa Romeo. And they made some beautiful sports cars, even
Yes.
up until a few years ago.
Yes, the Italians do beauty, automotive beauty, like nobody's business. The problem is they need to hire a bunch of German engineers. I remember a couple
Kind of
years
like
ago,
Lamborghini hiring Audi or selling to Audi.
basically, a couple years ago, my son Jason, who has a lot of wheel estate, as you call it,
Mm,
um, he went to look at an Alpha 4C, which
yep.
was the little two-seater sports car, just a lovely mid-engine thing, carbon fiber chassis. You know, it ticked all the right boxes. And then I drove it. And I couldn't stop driving it fast enough. It was abysmal. Ride quality, build quality. It was basically it was a gorgeous looking Italian kit car.
So it was the quintessential style over substance.
Oh yes. Oh, and you would think that an Italian car would have a row your own gearbox. Oh no, 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 no. It had an automated manual, which was good at neither. So it was probably one of the most unpleasant driving experiences I've ever had. It was a pure letdown.
Yeah,
It
which
was
is
awful.
it's just a shame when a car is as pretty
Oh,
as the
it was
car is.
gorgeous,
Yeah,
gorgeous, but it's now gone from the market
right.
after one product cycle. Um, so anyhow, they've got a couple of um, they've got a couple of crossovers: the Stelvio and the Tonale, or as I
Okay.
call it, the toenail. And those aren't really selling that well. The Stelvio is, again, a really gorgeous product
Yep.
let down by some really awful execution, especially on the interior and the infotainment system, which, as we all know, is now the price of competition in the car market.
Mm,
Basically, how well does it integrate with your phone? And how good is the user interface when you're stuck in traffic? So it's
okay.
no longer about driving dynamics. So anyhow, so we've gone through just a couple of the brands. You also have Citroën, which is again a French brand that used to be sold here. It's still sold in Europe. Um, Historically, a little bit on the weird side. You know,
Known for good ride quality, though.
oh yeah, it wasn't, but it was an acquired taste, kind of like Gauloi's cigarettes,
Okay.
um, or escargot. Um, and then you have DS, DS, which used to be just the top trim level for Citroen, but no, they decided to make it its own brand. I've never seen a DS, but I'm told they're out there somewhere.
Okay.
Okay, so we'll keep going. Let's see, you've got Opel, which GM, mighty GM couldn't make a go of in Europe, so they sold it off to PSA, which then became part of Stellantis. Same thing with GM's English brand, Vauxhall, which again doesn't exist anywhere outside of England. So you've got a lot of these little one-off brands. You've got
Hmm.
Fiat, but what is Fiat anymore? It used to be, okay, you've got small cars, you like the Fiat 500, and you've got cars like the Fiat 124 Spider. Neat little cars. But they had a reputation for beginning to rust while they were on the assembly line. So, okay, so you've got another struggling brand. And let's see, there's 14 of them, so I'm probably missing somebody. Um, but I wrote about this in a comment on a Facebook page that was talking about Stellantis, and I basically went through, if I were in charge of Stellantis with all these 14 brands, here's what I'd do. And I believe I called Vauxhall the English patient.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, well, Opel is kaput, um, and needs to be taken out and shot at dawn. Um, and I actually got some really good comments back on that. Some people said, that's exactly what they need. Are you sure you shouldn't be working for them? I said, well, I'm in the book. If somebody
Well,
wants, if
you
Carlos
are
wants to call me.
you are, but sometimes the last thing that people want to hear is what they need to be told. The
Yes.
old saying
And
is, if you want to make friends, you tell them what they want to hear. If you want to help people, you tell them what they need to hear.
exactly. And so you've got that. Um, you've got Maserati, which again is, storied name in automotive circles. Great racing heritage, but their current product line is a couple of forgettable sedans and a couple of almost equally forgettable crossovers
Well, it
that
seems
aren't
like
that aren't
Maserati,
really related to the Alfa Romeo crossovers. So
yeah, like
you've got
Maserati
multiple.
had Maserati had a bit of a renaissance 10 years ago,
Uh-huh.
and there were some really pretty vehicles, some well-received vehicles, but it doesn't seem like they ever moved on to the next generation.
Well, this is the problem because they spend a lot of money at Maserati engineering, and again their product planning seems a little bit schizophrenic. They started developing EVs because being in Europe, they were convinced that Europe was going to ban petrol engines and everybody was going to have EVs. So we will have EV Maseratis. And they've developed them. And I think they're on sale, but I'll be damned if I've ever seen one here in Southern California. And stuff like that is stuff you would see here in Southern California,
Right.
especially around Newport Beach. And nothing, crickets. Um, they must be playing a lot of computer solitaire in Maserati dealerships. Uh, so anyhow, you again, and Carlos was just here in the United States and talking with dealers and talking with the dealer council and getting an earful from a lot of people. And he basically came back with a pronouncement that a lot of these brands have basically 2 years to start showing a profit or face the axe. Now, whether the axe is they'll close the division or close the brand, or whether the axe is we're going to sell off this asset to some other sucker, I don't know.
Right.
But he's basically given an ultimatum. Everybody needs to make money within 2 years. I think he's smoking something because some of these brands, I don't know if you look at their history, they've almost never made money. So
Right.
why should they start now?
Yeah, so let's cut to the chase here a little bit. The so it seems like if you look at, for example, the Jeep brand, which is the gold standard of product recognition and brand identity, one of them.
Yes, absolutely.
And if it seems like they can't help themselves but to create seven different trim levels, seven different models of each vehicle that they can't just cut it down and keep it simple, the old keep it simple, stupid.
Yep.
Let's have three or four or five things we do really, really well. And we're going to market the hell out of these things and we're going to make them as good as they can be. We're going to make the quality as good as they can be. We're going to focus our energies. It just seems like they can't bring themselves to do that, and it's biting them in the ass.
Yes. And that's part of it. Right now, I mean, Jeep is the Wrangler and the Gladiator truck, but then there are also, I mean, Jeep also brought out, I don't know if you recall the Renegade, which was a Kia Soul sized sort of crossover.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, didn't really have much in the way of off road chops, but it had the Jeep look.
Right.
Well, that's the last thing you want to do to a brand because it cheapens the brand.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and Jeep has had a number of product misfires. Uh, they had the Jeep Compass, they had the Jeep Patriot, they had the Renegade, as I said. Uh, Now they've just introduced, because their dealers wanted something pricier to sell and bigger because their customers were outgrowing the Grand Cherokee, which was their bread and butter SUV. They came out with bigger SUVs. They came out with the Wagoneer, and just in case you weren't confused enough yet, the Grand Wagoneer, which was basically the Wagoneer, but with much more gingerbread on it and inside. So it looks the same, but all of a sudden it was getting up to $90,000 for a Grand Wagoneer, a fully loaded Grand Wagoneer. And people are going, wait a minute. You want me to spend 100 and something $1,000 on a Jeep?
Right. And a Jeep that, from what I understand from watching some of the videos of the dealers, the build quality wasn't there. If you're spending $110,000 on a top end full size SUV, they want it dialed in.
Well,
And
and
there's
the other
a
thing,
lot of
the
fit
other
and
thing
finish
is,
issues and electronics problems.
uh, I don't know about the electronics issues, but everybody has electronics issues because let's face it, automakers aren't good at making smartphones,
Right.
and that's what modern cars have become. The electronic suite is now basically the equivalent of a smartphone, but instead of being able to realize your mistake, find your mistakes, and correct it with a software update,
Mhm.
if you make a mistake with the hardware on a vehicle infotainment system, you're stuck with it for at least 18 months.
Right.
And that kind of turnaround, as you said, can bite you in the butt. So I mean, I've driven the Wagoneer and the Grand Wagoneer, and they're very nice vehicles. I like the Grand Cherokee. A friend of ours bought a Grand Cherokee L, and but she decided to get the V6, and she later told my wife, huge mistake, I should have got the V8.
Yeah.
Except now
Yeah.
Stellantis has moved, Jeep and Ram have moved away from the Hemi V8, and they've now got this twin turbo Hurricane inline six, which I've driven it. It's a really nice engine, but it's not a V8. It's more powerful than a V8, but it doesn't have the same visceral oomph, if you
And
will.
and that video that I was watching that had a long interview with a very large dealer from the Midwest, he was lamenting the fact that they discontinued the Cherokee. They still have the Grand Cherokee and they have the smaller SUV, but he thought that it was really hurting the Jeep brand that they got rid of kind of the entry level midsize SUV, which was the Cherokee, and it created a void in their lineup that was more affordable, was something that people could still have the size, the midsize SUV that they wanted, maybe for smaller family, 1 to 2 kids, that kind of thing. But all of a sudden, the price point for going to the Grand Cherokee had jumped up so much that there was nothing in that range, and so was
Yes,
that a miscalculation?
and that's a miscalculation on the part of the product planners. But here's the thing: the Cherokee that dealer is probably talking about is the one that everybody loved from the early '90s, which was um, square body Cherokee. That's the
Hmm.
one everybody thinks of. That's not the last Cherokee they were selling. The last Cherokee they were selling was much more rounded, and it was built on, I think, a front drive platform, which
Okay.
gets which gets me to a big part of the problem that Jeep has had, and FCA, Stellantis, whatever they're going to be called next, um, is I had a great discussion back in May with a friend of mine, Ken from Iowa, who we got to talking about, the Jeep brand. And, Jeep had this unassailable brand image,
Yep.
rugged, battle tested, everything. But, and he says where they lost their way is when they started having to put a badge on the fender that said trail rated. As he said, no Jeep should ever leave the factory that wasn't trail rated, because where did those non-trail rated Jeeps wind up? Hertz and National.
Hmm.
I've rented them. They're awful. I rented the Jeep Cherokee that literally could not go up a snowy driveway in Wisconsin, even in four-wheel drive mode, because the tires were all season tires,
Right.
which means, well, they may be all season, but they don't work in winter.
Well, they work in maybe California winter.
Which isn't winter.
When?
So anyhow, but his point was that Jeep had squandered this brand heritage and brand image by basically dumbing down the product and calling things trail rated or whatever. Now, can Jeep and FCA get everything back? I think they can, but to your point, they need to really narrow their focus and say, we're going to stop trying to be all things to all people. Yes, we can have hybrids, but I don't know that there should be, and they've got one coming. I'm not sure there should be a fully electric Jeep, because if your intent is to show that you can go off road, there aren't a lot of charging stations out in the middle of Moab.
Yep.
And to your point, you probably don't need 12 different trim levels for the Jeep Wrangler or Gladiator. You've got the Renegade, you've got the Moab, you've got the Mojave, you've got this. I couldn't tell you what the differences are on those. You've got the Jeep Willys. Well, what the hell is a Willys? Well,
Right.
that's what Jeep used to be back after World War II. The people who remember that, they're not driving anymore. If,
Right.
if they're even if they're even above ground. So
So yeah, let's try to land the plane here a little bit.
yeah.
So where do we go from here for Stellantis and Jeep and Dodge and Ram? I mean, we haven't really talked a lot about Ram, but they make some really good vehicles, some really good trucks.
Oh yeah,
But
I just spent 1,000 miles and a week in a rented Ram Bighorn.
Hmm.
Wonderful vehicle, powered by a V6 with the e-torque system, which is basically a mild hybrid assist. Got decent fuel economy, was able to tow our boat back there so I could take it to the marina to get it winterized. Really nice vehicle, very comfortable. Not quite as good as our F-150, but I looked up the price and it was 2/3 of the price.
Right.
Out the door. Okay, that's not too bad.
Is that kind of it where maybe Stellantis and Carlos Tavares have to eat a little crow and admit that they got too aggressive with the pricing and dial the pricing back by 10 or 15%?
I think that would probably be a really good idea. I think their shareholders in the business media would start screaming unless they can prove that even though they're going to pull back on the pricing, the profitability will remain high. And that's the trick, because but the other thing is, with 14 separate brands by their count, that's too many mouths to feed.
Right.
And that's not going to work.
Yeah, and so you saw back in the financial crisis when GM went through bankruptcy, and I think back then Chrysler
Yeah, yeah.
went through
That's how
bankruptcy.
FCA was created. Was Chrysler
Right.
went through bankruptcy and got sold to the Italians.
But Pontiac went away, Saturn went away, Oldsmobile went away. I mean, storied brands that had been
Oh
around
yeah.
for 75 plus years. But I think GM was better for it, as much as some people miss the Pontiac brand and whatnot. But they had to swallow hard and say, okay, we've got to cull the herd a little bit and really focus on having brands that are not necessarily competing against each other, but that we can be profitable with. Is that something that Stellantis can do?
Well, they absolutely have to do it. Uh, Before we get off of the GM brands, remember, GM didn't kill Saturn and Pontiac and Hummer of their own volition.
Yeah,
They
fair.
they had they had the Obama administration holding a gun to their head, saying, "If you want us to approve your bankruptcy, you're gonna kill these brands." And they said, "Oh, okay, if we must." They
Right.
didn't want to. There were a lot of people in GM that wanted to keep Pontiac at least. Saturn was an afterthought creation. Hummer was just a ridiculous caricature of itself, and the new Hummer, which is now sold as a GMC, is an equally ridiculous caricature, but it weighs 9,000 pounds and it's the least efficient EV on the market.
Right.
It has a battery that weighs as much as most cars. But anyhow, I digress. So, yes, the problem with killing brands, especially with European brands, is you have European governments and European labor unions that refuse to acknowledge that some brands may have outlived their usefulness. And Stellantis, also in Europe at least, and maybe here in the US, but here in the US, it's much easier to shut down a factory,
Yeah.
even a UAW factory. In Europe, you'll get riots in the streets. You'll get assassination attempts of senior executives if you threaten to close a factory, especially in Italy or France.
Right.
Now they don't, and the Italian and French governments, they will fight tooth and nail to keep you from doing that and to make it almost impossible for any corporation to do so, which may be one of the reasons that Stellantis is headquartered in the Netherlands, because I don't think they've got any factories there. but
Hmm.
that's where their corporate headquarters are. So
Right.
they can go, hey, it's not us. It's coming from the head office in the Netherlands. Don't shoot the messenger, literally.
All right, go there.
So, but let's
So,
face it.
yeah.
You've got what I said in my commentary on Stellantis and their 14 needy brands. Look, you've got Peugeot, you've got Citroën. Pick one. Pick one, Pierre. That's going to be the brand. The other one slips beneath the waves. Same thing with Vauxhall. You don't need a separate English brand. Besides, almost nothing is made in England anymore
Hmm.
outside of F1 cars. In Germany, why does Opel exist? It's not that the
Right.
Germans are clamoring for those. The Germans are clamoring for I don't know what.
Staying
Um,
warm is better.
Probably, yeah. I mean, Fiat. You say, okay, well, we'll have Fiat, and that'll be our small car and small crossover brand, and we'll do some EVs there because small EVs make sense in Europe. They don't make sense here in the States, but small EVs make sense in Europe because nobody drives very far. They want to go long distances. They hop on a train.
Right. And then they can have alpha for maybe a little bit more performance.
Well, again, you've got to figure
40.
out, okay, as the world moves away from petrol engines toward EVs and hybrids, does alpha still have a place? Same thing with Maserati. Now they've got Maserati EVs. I don't know if that makes sense.
Hmm.
Maybe they do high end hybrids and plug-in hybrids. I don't know, but
But
it's really a bit of a mess.
at a
And
certain point, with the economic realities of what the global economy is going through right now, and if you get outside of the U.S., the economies in Europe are not very strong right now. In fact,
no,
Germany's headed back into a recession, and they're having all sorts of problems over there with their manufacturing base, and they kind of hitched their wagon to China, which we won't go into now. But at what point do they have to start looking at survival rather than thriving? It just let's like you were saying, let's at a certain point you got to cut some sandbags off of the balloon to keep it in the air.
yeah, to gain altitude. And if you look at it, I mean, Chrysler in all of its various iterations, they've had so many brushes with death going back to Lee Iacocca or even before Lee Iacocca. And, they had to get government loans in the 70s and they paid them back because they came out with the K car and the minivan.
Hmm.
And you, you keep going through these feast and famine cycles. And the question is, how many times can you revive Lazarus?
Right. Yeah. So it'll be interesting. We'll be watching, obviously, how this plays out, but it's definitely a different environment right now. You've got in my world where I'm looking at economics and what's going on with the consumer. We've got the high-end consumers doing just fine, it seems. They're spending money, they've got their assets have grown really nicely, but for the general consumer, maybe you could say the bottom 50% or even the bottom 60%, things are a little tight right now. And it's not as easy to buy a $50,000, $60,000 vehicle to
Yeah,
replace one that's coming off of lease or what have you. And
yeah. I
so,
mean, the average new car goes up goes across the curb right around $50,000. The average new EV goes across the curb at about $60,000. So it's a 20% premium. That's a big chunk of change. And everybody wants to talk about the vaunted $20,000 or $25,000 EV. The $25,000 EV is a used EV, and not a
right.
particularly good one at that.
Right. And a lot of people, they just don't understand math, when it comes to financing a vehicle. If
That's why
if
Las
you
Vegas does so well.
exactly, well, if you look at a 5-year car loan, 5 years, 60 months,
Yep.
if the price is $60,000, including your taxes and your registration, your fees, and all that kind of thing, and you're not able to put a big chunk of money down with 0% interest, that's $1,000 a month payment.
Uh-huh.
I remember when I sold Hondas back in the day, that was is 25 plus years ago. About 75, 80% of the time, and this was back then, if I had asked somebody, what do you want your car payment to be? They'd say $250 a month.
Yeah.
Now, that was 25 years ago. I get that. But I think a lot of people now, maybe that number would be $400 to $500 a month.
Yes.
And especially when we've seen food inflation do what it's done, we've seen auto insurance rates rise, we've seen, of course, many other costs rise. Finding enough to buy a new car or lease a new car is not an easy feat, especially when you're not in the 0% interest rate environment that we were just a few years ago. So it's definitely a more challenging time for all car makers. But if you're not putting out a competitive product that's compelling, that is hitting the ground running, that is high quality, and makes people feel good about making that $800,000, $900,000 a month payment, you're going to be struggling.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. No, I've managed to drive a few um, Stellantis products, uh, Rams, Jeeps, and they're nice products, but they're not knock your socks off world beaters. They're good. They're good.
And
Um,
is
I've
good
I've
good enough?
yeah, I've driven the Chrysler 300C. If I lived back there in the Midwest, I'd find a used 300C, and that would be my you know that would be the perfect vehicle for you to go down to your baseball tournaments down in Iowa and everything, because it's built for the wide open spaces of the Midwest.
Hmm.
It's a great vehicle. You know, as long as you don't get on too many twisty bit roads, it's a big, comfortable sedan. It's quiet, powerful. It's the classic American cruiser.
It's got to be all-wheel drive back here, though.
You could get them with all-wheel drive.
I know you can, but I couldn't buy a used one with two-wheel drive.
Then that might be a problem. But no, but you look at some of those things. I drove a Dodge Challenger, marvelous vehicle. You know, you could land a helicopter on that hood. It was as big as a landing pad, but boy, it was a nice cruiser.
Yep.
So anyhow,
All right. Well,
we should wrap this.
I think for the most part, we've covered a lot of ground. The bottom line is Stellantis, they're a good car company. they've got some great people who work there. They've got, as some people call them, the true believers, and they're capable of making some great automobiles.
The only problem is they have less of the true believers because a lot of their top talent in the last year headed for the exits.
Yeah. And
And that's
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 that's a
that should be the
statement.
most troubling sign for Wall Street is when the good people start leaving. That means that the people who are left are the ones who weren't good enough to
To get
rise to the
another,
top.
right, to change jobs. They're hanging on.
Yeah, they're hanging out by their fingernails,
All right.
and most of them are operating in CYA mode.
Yeah. Well, we want them to survive because, of course, Jeep and Ram, especially, are iconic brands and they're good vehicles, but they're going to have to make some adjustments pretty quickly because things are not heading in the right direction, whether that's a combination of reducing the number of brands under FCA, not FCA, I'm sorry, under Stellantis, or it's cutting prices, or it's listening more to their dealers who are more in touch with what the customer wants.
I think it's going to have to be an all of the above
Yeah.
answer on that multiple choice. The other thing is, now we didn't really get into it, but Ram has done something brilliant. They have an electric pickup coming, but unlike the GM and Ford electric pickups, the Ram pickup will have what they call a gas range extender. So, in other words, you're not going to have a you're not
It's
going
not
to
a true
have
hybrid.
well, it's not really a hybrid because the engine won't be connected mechanically to the drivetrain, but it'll start up and you'll be able to burn gas. So let's say you're going, like my wife and I do, across country. You'll be able to fill up, and they're talking about, with the range extender, your range going from 400, 400 miles, maybe 350 or so, to 500 or 600 miles with the range extender. And then you'll fill up the range extender. If you're still out in the middle of nowhere, you just keep going on the range extender and it's generating the electricity you need. And you're out in the middle of nowhere. So, you know,
But it reduces the range anxiety that a lot of people feel with true
it
EV.
eliminates the range anxiety. You won't
Right.
have range anxiety. And when you're running around town, going to Home Depot or Lowe's or whatever, you'll be on pure electric and you won't be burning a drop of gas. It's kind of
Right.
the best of both worlds. And people I know that have seen the truck, they say it's a really nice truck and it's
All
well
right.
executed.
Well,
So
maybe there's
there's
some
hope.
hope there.
There's some
Yep.
hope.
All right, Fred. Well, thanks for all your insights and taking the time to talk about this. We'll definitely be watching. And for everybody who's watching this, let us know, have you owned a Jeep? Have you, or a Ram? What do you think of the changes they've made? What do you wish that they would do that they haven't done? And like and subscribe to the video because it helps us out a lot. And otherwise, we'll see you in the next one.